Thanks a lot. Wonderful to be here. I'll collect all my technical remarks in the beginning which may be helpful for the recording. I have pretty naturally changed the title of my presentation, which also makes me sort of nervous because what I'm going to say reacts to quite some things that have been said, in particular to the cognitive aspects, because I want to discuss drives as cognitive faculties in Schelling, among other things. So I'll try to build in as many reactions to and interactions with what I've seen and heard here in my presentation, but that makes me sort of nervous because it becomes kind of open-ended. Okay, so topic will be drives in Schelling, drives as cognitive faculties. And of course, it's wonderful to be here and talk about a local philosopher, Schelling. And I'm also going to refer with one quote to another local philosopher who's not on the program, but who might be very interesting, Franz von Baader, who has been in close interaction with Schelling while being here, and who brought Schelling into contact with all sorts of mystical and Gnosticist traditions. I'll also give you one quote from Jakob Böhme, but that will be all I'm going to do with source studies. Mainly what I did is hunting the word Trieb in the works of Schelling, with one basic motivation, namely that the Historisches Wörterbuch has it perfectly right in its article on Trieb when it says that everyone has the idea that Schelling has something profound to say about Trieb, but once you start looking, it's not a term that's discussed systematically in the works of Schelling. And maybe some other related terms are more prominent, terms such as, and you all know those existentialist terms, hunger, thirst, addiction, and so on. In order to avoid going into those terms, which also would mean tell a pretty well-known story about the later Schelling in particular, I'll look into the word Trieb in Schelling and some of its cognates in his work. On the handout, you'll find quite a large number of quotes, and I'm not going to offer apologies for not translating those quotes. All of you can read it and understand it, and it's part of the fascination of those quotes that they are written in a very distinctive style that also teaches you a lot about the terminological field. Preliminary remarks. The conceptual field, as we've heard and as we've seen in Jörg Noller's presentation surrounding the focus term Trieb, and I'll use drive as a translation, in the period around 1800 is extremely rich and extremely unstructured. Reimarus, in his book on Kunsttriebe, states explicitly in the Vorbericht that this is a deplorable state of affairs and that he intends to repair this chaos, the semantic chaos. This chaos manifests itself along two dimensions. Firstly, the term Trieb, drive itself, is embedded into and coordinated with a large number of related terms that in many cases are offered and without detailed argument as alternatives to drive. Just a couple of examples. Kant's Anthropology, in the chapter on the character of our species, has within a few lines the terms Trieb, Anlage, Neigung, Inklination, Hang, Streben, Leidenschaften, Propensio, Instinct. Or paragraph 80 of the Anthropology on Leidenschaften, passions, propensio, Hang, Instinct, Triebneigung, Inclinatio, Passio, Animi. Or take Blumenbach's text, which has already been quoted here, where he says at the very beginning, Trieb oder Tendenz oder Bestreben. So explicitly not taking a decision which is the main of these terms. Secondly, we have many different forms of, types of drives around in this period, and we have heard many of those. So all my lists are, of course, very incomplete. Schillers sinnlicher Trieb, Formtrieb, Spieltrieb, Kunsttriebe, Bildungstrieb. Interestingly, quite a number of those drives are highly general in nature. So we tend to think that drives belong to our animal nature, are pretty concrete. Blumenbach is emphasizing that Kunsttriebe are determined by being directed towards one particular sort of product and being inflexible. We also see a number of drives on a very abstract and general level, which already is remarkable in itself and which already subverts traditional hierarchies between higher and lower levels of whatsoever in this period. Some more specific ones: Kristallisationstrieb, Begattungstrieb, Elterntrieb in Kant. Some more examples for the general kinds next to the Schiller examples. Very interesting passage in Schleiermachers Reden über die Religion, where he's talking about an Ausdehnungs- and Individuationstrieb. He's not using those terms, but that's precisely what he's doing there. Schelling on the Ergänzungstrieb and many, many, many others. Also, we have some terms which are less technical, although, as we've seen, a term such as Triebfeder sort of oscillates between being technical and metaphorical at the same time. Antrieb, Triebwerk, Getriebe. Reimarus, at the beginning of his book on Kunsttrieb, is talking about der Betrieb der Tiere, which might be translated as animal behavior, but also referring to economic metaphors as animal economy, and sort of explicitly playing with an everyday term which in this context acquires a potentially technical meaning. Some typical features of this conceptual field have already become visible during our meetings. We see that drives are clearly dispositional concepts, but concepts that are in a relevant sense also specific without being completely determined. Fichte gives a kind of definition in die Grundlage. Ein Trieb als ein sich selbst produzierendes Streben, das bestimmt ist. A striving that produces itself and that is determined. That idea of having a general notion of trieb which needs to be specified, needs to be determined, also is part of the reason why we have this huge field of overarching concepts and specific subforms here. Second key feature, we see an inclination, a tendency towards continuously operating with dualist drive notions. In Reinhold, in Fichte, in Schiller with the third, in Plato. So drives seem to operate in a field where we have at least or typically two opposing forces coming together and interacting with one another. Thirdly, drives are not merely just dispositional, but they also have a function in analyzing how dispositions turn into actions. We did discuss the role of motives, moving forces, so they carry a strong motivational connotation, and I'll return to that in a later part of my paper when I briefly refer to some of the mechanical notions in the background of the notion of drive. We have already heard about that in the very first paper by Catherine Wilson. We should expect that for quite a number of reasons, all those aspects of the conceptual field of drive do play a role and are important for Schelling's ways of dealing with this term. Some of those concepts, such as Bildungstrieb, indeed feature prominently in Schelling's texts, and some of the highly characteristic notions in Schelling's ever more highly dramatized phrases in his later philosophy, such as hunger, thirst, addiction, Sucht, are clearly related to the semantics of drive. However, apart from the notion of Bildungstrieb that is indeed discussed precisely where we would expect it in his philosophy of nature when Schelling is dealing with organic beings, none of those other terms gets a sustained systematic discussion in Schelling. So that's the reason why I'm going to be cherry-picking throughout his oeuvre, and I'm not going to address the awkward issue of continuity or discontinuity in Schelling. All of the usages of drive in Schelling, as I hope will be clear, are related to some fundamental Schellingian, typically Schellingian ideas, in particular the idea that we need to very systematically subvert traditional hierarchies of the higher and the lower in ever new exciting ways. That can mean that we need to find a more fundamental ground that is providing a foundation for what seemed to be fundamental so far, with dramatic implications, for instance, for the status of God as a first foundation. But it also has implications for the way how drives and the irrational aspects of drive and, as I will try to show, the scientific connotations of moving towards future discoveries become related, and that provides a bridge between drives and indeed cognitive activity. I'll start with, despite everything I said so far, with a term that is not drive itself, but a related term which is terminologically slightly more precisely defined, the term instinct. And I'll leave out, hoping for your forgiveness, a discussion of Schelling's notion of Bildungstrieb. I've given you the key quote in the first footnote on my handout. Instincts. Instincts are used by Schelling typically in describing procedures that are successful but not deductive and not directly goal-directed. Okay, that's all things that we have already heard quite a number of times. Typically and significantly, he applies this aspect of, or this reading of instincts also to, and very prominently to, the progress of philosophy. And in particular to Kant and the reception of Kantian philosophy. Kant gets a lot of things right for Schelling, but not because he had understood precisely what he was doing. He did get things right from instinct. Kant himself cannot control what's happening within his own philosophizing, and of course he cannot control what's going to be done with his philosophy by those people who are reading and taking up what Kant has done. And there also the notion of instinct plays a role. So Kant does things on the basis of instinct, which then in reading Kant is worked out and elaborated upon and made more transparent. What he gets right and what is constructive and successfully done with his ideas happens without him having intended it. Quote, wahre Wirkungen sind meist andere, als die beabsichtigt worden sind oder die im Verhältnis der Mittel stehen, durch welche sie hervorgebracht wurden. What comes about, what is brought about by a text or an idea is not determined by the intentions or by the means that have been applied in producing those ideas. You'll see that Kant uses the plant and, without using the term, the Bildungstrieb of plant, in describing precisely this process of reception of philosophical ideas. Quote 2. Is it okay if I read the quotes in German? Ja? Es ist nur ein System, das durch alle die aufeinanderfolgenden Erscheinungen nach dem letzten Punkt seiner Verklärung hindrängt. That's from the discussion of Kant in his lectures on the history of modern philosophy. Wie die Pflanze, die zu wachsen anfängt, nicht weiß, bei welchem Punkt sie anlangen wird, dennoch hat sie ein sicheres Gefühl desselben. Und eben dieses Gefühl ist das sie Treibende. So Trieb here is transformed into an active verb, ist das, was wir den Trieb in ihr nennen. So, wenn in dieser ganzen Folge keiner einen deutlichen Begriff des Ziels hatte, fühlte doch jeder, dass es gelte, irgendein Letztes zu erreichen. Und eben dieses Gefühl, dieser Trieb, der mit Kant in die Philosophie gekommen war, unterschied diese Epoche von allen früheren. So Kant is a drive philosopher. What Schelling does here with the image of the comparison of plants and the Bildungstrieb, the growth processes in plants, is saying what's happening in Kant and in reading Kant does not happen in the mode of explicit knowledge, but still it's an ordered and structured way of proceeding, of discovering new ideas that he labels as feeling, and indeed is a form of feeling that stands up to the epistemic standards of certainty. So this idea of a certain feeling is a pretty remarkable term in these contexts. Another way of putting this idea, and that's a way that's going to return later in my talk, is that Kant's mind had a natural and unstoppable drive towards totality. Quote 3, which, taken together with the previous quote, means that, of course, Kant had a tendency towards being or becoming a systematic thinker. He couldn't get there, but he initiated a drive that then could be taken up by others. And, of course, in the end, Schelling can view himself as the culmination of this drive that Kant introduced into philosophy. Being certain and being, in this sense, conducive to philosophical progress, an instinct can also be called, and Schelling does explicitly so, can be called right, richtig. We have passages in which Schelling calls the instinct of philosophy a richtig fühlender Instinkt. And here we have epistemic correctness and feelings and instinct brought together in one passage. We also have a richtiger Instinkt. So instinct can be correct, can be epistemic forces. Instincts share further features with epistemic concepts. Instincts can be described as being general, as being determined, and not just vague or preconceptual. No one would charge Kant as being vague or preconceptual. And they give rise to specific cognitive faculties. More about that in a moment. If we look at the definitions that Kant gives of Trieb, drive, and instinct, we see that on the one hand he's close to the more biological connotations of this term, and on the other hand those definitions already operate on a surprisingly general level. Thus referring back to what I said at the beginning about general forms of drives. Two examples, and you see also that instincts and drives are closely related. A drive towards motion, movement, determined by sensibility, quote 4, is instinct. Or, on a far more abstract level, bloß partiales Einssein des Subjekts und des objektiven Grundes, der Identität und der Totalität, ist Instinkt. Keep in mind what Schelling said earlier about Kant as a philosopher who is driving towards totality. So this totality aspect is taken up here. O, was im Instinkt des Tieres handelt, ist noch ein ganz objektives, aber es ist dieses Objektive, ohne den Charakter des Objektiven abzulegen, zugleich ein subjektives, was auch nachher an den Tieren mit einem Schein wirklicher, eigener Vernunft täuscht. That's an echo of a standard quote which we have in Reimarus, and the Reimarus quotation that animals exhibit something which looks as if it was reason, but it's only at its best an analog form of reason and not genuine reason. We may ask whether everything I said so far about the cognitive powers of instincts or drives isn't criticized here explicitly, because after all, in the end, there's a form of deception built in here. But I would urge that we refer this deceptive aspect to what Schelling says about wirklicher in eigener Vernunft, kind of individualized, personalized forms of reason or rationality that are individualized in this particular being, animal. So we can easily explain away this deceptiveness by saying what's deceptive is not that there is a natural link between instincts and drives and reason and rational activity, but what's deceptive is that it's individualized reason. So reason should then be understood as something which is shared, spread out, and just not a personal kind of thing. Another remarkable phrase which takes up quite some notions from Kantian Transcendental Aesthetics and Logic is the following quote 5. So sammelt sich endlich das Mannigfaltige in jedem Naturwesen im Instinkt, als der alles belebenden Seele, ohne deren Antrieb nie ein sich selbst vollendetes Ganzes zustande käme. So here, instinct is described as a sort of transcendental apperception-like faculty that integrates the manifoldness of data into a in itself perfected whole, complete whole. And in the passages immediately following this quote, Schelling is saying, now that just means, and that sounds pretty Kantian, that an animal perceives on the basis of and within its instinct. Similar phrase, and you see that all those quotes sort of circle around a limited number of key ideas. In instinct, an animal acts as totality. So instincts thus clearly have an integrative function for Schelling. It's not just egoist, animal, I hardly dare saying drives any longer. Instincts have an integrative function that can support both actions and perceptions. With this in mind, it becomes less surprising that Schelling can frequently talk about instincts as being general. We have heard quite a bit about general feelings already in Dietmar Heidemann's talk, which can be feelings that are directed towards spread out social structures, which are related to the Kantian terms of a sensus communis, which is also general in the sense of being integrative with respect to my own cognitive faculties, but also in the sense of being shared by all possible participants in particular types of discourse. Those ideas can explain why instinct in Schelling is also used prominently in analyzing the work of art. There's a Schiller background here, but if you look at the passages on art at the end of the system of transcendental idealism, for instance, Schelling uses the term instinct when he tells us that works of art are produced without consciousness, from instinct, without, of course, thereby becoming in any way deficient. This brings me to some of the translations into concrete faculties that Schelling offers us for the term instinct. And again, you see quite some of the phrases that I have already presented you coming up again. Instincts can give rise to or operate as an instinktartiges Vorgefühl. And Vorgefühl, I find an interesting term because it means that it's a feeling that's not actualized in the here and now, but a feeling that is directed towards a future. Which, of course, being a feeling, it can never define or deduce or understand or get hold of with certainty. Still, it can, remember what I just said about correctness of feelings, with a positive and correct epistemic stance relate to an open and determined future. And you see the same terms returning when Schelling in a somewhat later text relates drives, instincts, Kunsttriebe to praesagia, which just would be the Latin version of a Vorgefühl or foreknowledge, or divination. So you know that Schelling has been fascinated with the power of divination, and with those notions he thinks to have hold of an idea, an analysis of the kind of faculties that make those obscure and obscurantist faculties understandable and even acceptable. If I were to summarize what has been said so far with respect to what this might mean for scientific methodology, I would say that's precisely what the method of discovery in science requires us. We need to look into a future that we cannot yet know with certainty, but which we can approach with what we today call educated guesses. And that translates easily into divination. Educated guess is a term that's also pretty close to some Kantian phrases. So Kant is indeed recommending us to engage in guesswork if we want to really extend our knowledge in the direction of a system of the nature under empirical laws. And we see that in Schelling, with the term of instinct, all those notions come together here. At this point, I also include, but that's a kind of footnote or marginal remark, a minuscule reference to Franz von Baader, who in his book on Elementarphysiologie discussed drives as regulative principles in the Kantian sense. Drives for us define what is possible for us to do or demarcate our realm of potential agency. In this sense, drives can be described as regulative principles. Let me turn to now drives, in particular, usages of the term of Trieb in Schelling. And we'll see that everything that I have said so far about instincts continues to be relevant for what he does with drives. Drives can acquire higher function, and doing so, they go beyond reductively egoist or purely animal attitudes. Also keep in mind what we have heard about Schiller's Formtrieb, for instance, which is directed explicitly against pure feeling or a pure sensuous inclination. Where the Formtrieb in humans takes a leading function, there, Schiller quote, ist die höchste Erweiterung des Seins. So in Schiller too, and we'll see in Schelling also, we have a reading and understanding of drives that discusses drives explicitly in terms of generalization, of extension, of totalizing the scope of our experience. This becomes related frequently, and when studying Schelling's texts again and again, to me it has been surprisingly frequent in Schelling with respect to the practice of doing active research in science, in Wissenschaft. One example, quote 6, wenn aber in einem gegebenen wissenschaftlichen Zustand dem Trieb zum Umfassenden und Allgemeinen, der etwa durch Philosophie aufgeregt wird, weder die Fülle klassischer Gelehrsamkeit noch die einer wahren auf Naturanschauung gegründeten Erfahrung das notwendige Gegengewicht hält, so ist unvermeidlich, dass das Ganze früher oder später überstürze. This passage echoes, for instance, what Kant says about the relationship between genius and taste in the critique of the power of judgment. We need some kind of checks and controls of our creative power, where the creative power here is described as a drive towards the general and the comprehensive that is introduced and induced by philosophy. So if we link that to the Kant genius and taste discussion, we should say this drive initiated by philosophy towards totality is what represents genius in these contexts. And the same kind of ideas return again and again in Schelling text. So you may look at the lengthy quote 7. I'll just pick out 3 words from this lengthy quote. Under bullet point 7, you have das Allleben der Natur, kind of totalizing perspectives on nature. In 8, it's Gesamtleben der Wissenschaft. So just as nature is an integrated, vitalist whole, the same applies to science and to religion and to art. And this is arrived at via science, which in 9 again is described in terms of a Trieb zum Allgemeinen that needs to be checked and controlled, but which is a necessary condition for arriving at a totality, a living totality of understanding nature and of developing a system of science. We could go on. When Schelling is lecturing on the method of academic studies, In the first sentences, he tells his public, die Jünglinge, wenn er mit dem Begriff der akademischen Laufbahn, Quote 8, zuerst in die Welt der Wissenschaften eintritt, kann, je mehr er selbst Sinn und Trieb für das Ganze hat, desto weniger einen anderen Eindruck davon erhalten als den eines Chaos, in dem er noch nichts unterscheidet, oder eines weiten Ozeans, auf den er sich ohne Kompass und Leitstern versetzt sieht. The world of science has the shape of a chaotic structure, again some kind of Kantian echoes here, and that becomes manifest in particular if we feel the proper drive towards totality that characterizes the ideal student and future researcher. This also means that research, just as I said in my section on instincts, is an activity that makes it very plausible to talk in terms of drives or instincts. It's aimed at a Gesamtleben der Wissenschaft, at understanding the totality of objects that are studied by science, but it cannot do so in terms of already knowing what the result of the process of research can be, and perhaps not even without knowing what it should be. The same idea that drives typically are related towards unified, integrated, holist, totality structures occurs in other contexts too. Quote 9 is from Schelling's Philosophy of Nature, where towards the end you can read that there's a Trieb, aber alles Individuelle in der Natur in sich zu vereinigen. And via this drive wird auch zum Voraus ein gewisser Kreis möglicher Gestalten bestimmt sein. That's the kind of ideas that gave rise to Bader's remarkable phrase of drive as regulative principles. We need one additional step here to get clear about the way how Schelling deals with drives in those contexts. As in the model of two opposing drives in other authors, and also as in the model of two opposing forces in discussing the dynamics and the constitution of matter, Schelling discusses two fundamental forms of drives. One, selbstisch, ego-directed, self-centered, and two, a drive towards totality, which of course goes beyond my subjective egoist self. Man, indeed, for Schelling is characterized by overcoming this self-centeredness. Quotes, so we have already seen in Schiller the idea of a Spieltrieb, which also overcomes the opposition of the two lower level drives and then gives rise to something beautiful. If you look at quote 10, you see a similar idea in Schelling, which is also beautifully phrased by making use of the two terms that come from mechanics. Im Menschen dagegen hat mit dem absoluten Eintreten des Zentrum in ihm die Zentrifugenz auch die Zentrifugenz wieder in sich aufgenommen. So that should be aufgenommen. So that's a typically OCR problem. Was im Tier bloß selbstisch war, wird hier als Selbstisches zugleich an sich schön und erlangt Wert um seiner selbst willen. All sorts of Schiller references in this quote. As a summary of those ideas in Schelling, let's again look at another passage from Schelling's Lectures on the Method of Academic Studies that shows that a drive is key to arriving at a unified, scientific, even scientific in a higher sense, cognition of reality. But that also shows that this drive itself needs to be actualized. I want to introduce this quote and this idea here because it shows that the conceptual structure of drives and drives being set into action is highly complicated. So we do have this drive towards totality. We have already seen that it's philosophy that needs to initiate inside this drive. So that immediately introduces a pretty complicated multi-layer structure here. So not only do we need to control and tame down this drive, we also need to incite it in the first line. Die Philosophie ist ihrer Natur nach zum Umfassenden, zum Allgemeinen hinstrebend. You also see that Schelling is making intelligent use of all sorts of cognate terms in these phrases. Wenn nun im einzelnen Menschen oder im Ganzen eines Geschlechts sich mit dem universellen Geist höherer Wissenschaftlichkeit und der Erleuchtung durch Ideen die lebendigste und mannigfaltigste Erkenntnis des Einzelnen verbindet, so entsteht jenes erfreuliche Gleichmaß der Bildung, woraus nur das gesunde, gerade, tüchtige in aller Art von Wissenschaft und Handlung erwachsen kann. Wenn aber freilich in einem gegebenen wissenschaftlichen Zustand dem Trieb zu Umfassendem und Allgemeinem, der etwa durch Philosophie aufgeregt wird, and then we get this control quote that I have already given you. What's important here for me is this term of aufregen, which again refers to the discourse within which quite a lot of drive discussion unfolds in the 18th century, because aufregen clearly is a term that comes from the irritability tradition in the life sciences. In precisely these contexts, Schelling also is referring to social drives towards social structures. And I'll give you an instance for, again, phrases that echo quotes that we have already seen, in this case in Dietmar Heidemann's talk, by very briefly referring to what Schelling does under the strange title of an Ergänzungstrieb. That's clearly a drive that is directed towards totality. There is a Platonic background in it because we have those two halves supplementing one another to form a complete, well-rounded being in Plato. But that Schelling applies to the planetary system. In discussing the question whether planets do have a Ergänzungstrieb. He uses Ergänzungstrieb to understand some mechanical, or no, not mechanical, some fundamental forces in nature, in particular, perhaps gravitation, but explicitly cohesion and adhesion, so attractive forces between particular types of matter. And then he asks whether planetary bodies also exhibit this kind of drive to find a counterpart in another bit of matter. And he says no, so planets do not exhibit this drive because planets are completed in themselves. Again, you hear all sorts of traditional notions of the planetary system as perfect and perfected in itself. He describes it in precisely the drive terms we have already heard frequently here. What happens here is that these bodies step over from a drive to be in sich selbst, egoistically self-centered, towards being in others, or being one with others. And this phrase of being in others has already been highlighted by Dietmar in his talk. But again, this step from being egoistically centered upon yourself and finding yourself really in another being, that's precisely what is described in terms of an Ergänzungstrieb, which then in the planetary system isn't necessary any longer because their things are perfected already in themselves. Let me move towards some preliminary steps towards conclusion. By very briefly looking into another term that surrounds the term of drive. So I started with instinct, I said a bit about drives, and I would now want to look very briefly into one of the terms that may describe the mechanics of setting drives into motion. What's interesting here is to see that Schelling makes use of a term that is well known from mathematical mechanics of the 17th and 18th century, namely the term Solicitation, which has been used in understanding the strange fact that objects in rest can start moving let's say, scales, a lever that is in equilibrium, and a slight disturbance sets it into movement, or throw a stone vertically into the air. At a certain moment, it's going to be at rest, and then starting to move again immediately. What's happening there? So that's a transition between rest and movement. How can we understand it? And that's where Sollicitation comes to play a role as a kind of infinitesimal moment or element of motion, which can be present even if the object in question is in rest. The kind of descriptions that you get in mathematical mechanics is a facultas agendi, a faculty towards acting, Fähigkeit zu wirken, pouvoir, which is interesting for Schelling's discussion of potence, and it's a term that's again and again everywhere related to Leibnizian and Cartesian traditions. If we look at a quote such as quote 12, we see that Schelling discusses drives as, in this case referring to animals, Trieb zur Bewegung, aber die Richtung dieses Triebs ist ursprünglich unbestimmt. Nur insofern der Trieb zur Bewegung ursprünglich im Trieb ist, ist es der Sensibilität fähig, and so on. Towards the end of this quote, after the hyphen, Schelling continues, dieser Trieb aber geht ursprünglich, wie jeder Trieb, auf ein unbestimmtes, das Totality Aspect. Bestimmt wird ihm seine Richtung durch den äußeren Reiz. Irritabilität, also ursprünglich das Negative des animalischen Prozesses, ist das Positive der Sensibilität. What's interesting here is that Schelling discusses the necessity to set those drives towards totality into a determined and particular form of activity. And he does so in this passage by already going against the traditional hierarchies, that which normally would be thought to be the negative, that which is outside, which is even in terms of hierarchies beyond sensibility, is necessary to set the process of sensibility going, to determine the undetermined drive towards its particular form of activity or expression. The term Sollicitation is used prominently in later texts by Schelling, where Schelling describes human freedom as a situation in which we need precisely this kind of initial kick-off towards movement, which needs to come from something which is completely different from that which it aims at. And talking about freedom, we have juicy quotes such as 15, der Mensch ist auf jenen Gipfel gestellt, wo er die Selbstbewegungsquelle zum Guten und Bösen gleicherweise in sich hat. He's placed in a position and moment of eternal decision at a Scheidepunkt. Es muss daher ein allgemeiner Grund der Sollicitation, der Versuchung zum Bösen sein, wäre es auch nur um die beiden Prinzipien in ihm lebendig, das heißt, um ihn ihrer bewusst zu machen. The difficulty of having a multi-layered structure becomes more pressing here, even more pressing because it's not just a solicitation towards setting the drive in motion, but we also have a Grund that sets this Sollicitation going. In describing those states, Schelling again is using all sorts of mysticist terms, in particular, for instance, the Böhme term of aufwallen. What happens here is that something aground aufwallt, and then things start moving and start to flow. I'll come to my absolutely final words. We have seen that we can go ever more beyond towards more elementary, more fundamental levels of incitements of drives and setting them into motion. We can also start operating at the other extreme of a spectrum of activities by going towards more attenuated states, and one of my favorite quotes is quote 17. I just cannot avoid giving it to you. Es war nicht genug, sagte man, den Zusammenhang mit dem Objektiven der verstandlosen Natur aufgegeben zu haben, solange im Subjektiven noch ein so grober Begriff als der des Wissens geduldet wurde. Das Wissen selbst ist noch zu massiv, die Vergeistigung wird erst dann vollkommen sein, wenn statt desselben nur noch ein zarter, flüchtiger Duft von Ahndung und Gefühl übrig ist, also auch das Subjektive wieder subjektiviert wird. We went beyond knowledge in giving instincts and certain feelings a role in the process of science, and we need to go beyond knowledge in leaving the coarse form of knowledge and going towards these flüchtige Dufte von Ahndung und Gefühl. 3 summarizing lines. Human drives really are human. We have learned in Reimarus that the Triebe der Tiere may look human but aren't because they are determined. They are fixed in what they do. Here we have drives that are kept open on all levels. Still, they need to be described as drives, and where they should be necessarily drives might be open for discussions. Schelling studies, second remark, mechanisms of linking up drives and instinct with higher cognitive faculties, both at the beginning and the end of the spectrum of dealing with knowledge. And we may ask ourselves where the very deep, typically high metaphysics Schelling topics have hidden themselves in my presentation. I would say what I just said about transcending the realm of knowledge. In a dynamic process that still remains related towards a process towards, from and towards knowledge, is a typical aspect of Schelling's subversion of traditional hierarchies of good and evil, freedom and determination, God and the world, here applied to the realm of the cognitive and described consistently and throughout in terms of instincts and drives. Thanks a lot for your attention.